So, welcome back to 3rd Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this map should seem familiar to some of you because this is the same one that I was a part of back when we ran the War in the North scenario between Dale and the Dwarves and the Easterlings with a little bit of Orcish support, but this time in the same location the Battle of the Five Armies also took place, and that is what we are going to be seeing on display today. So, it's going to be an interesting one because it's pretty layered really in terms of what's actually going on. The way that they've set this up is interesting because there's no option, of course, to change the team that you're on partway through a battle, so it's going to be pretty peculiar because we're going to have a force of dwarves which are technically going to be marching permanently alongside the orcs. Of course, in reality they switched it up partway through the battle, but that's not an option in Medieval 2. But yes, everyone knows what the Battle of the Five Armies ultimately is. You've got the city of Dale, which is going to be under, again, just like with the War in the North, immediate pressure from the orcs and not a huge amount of chance for relief out here, so eventually they will have to fall back or be completely destroyed. You've got the dwarves and the elves fighting it out in the first part of the battle right in front of Erebor itself, and then of course the dwarves within will move out to engage the orcs when they start to swarm all over this location as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of the various factions get on in this rather chaotic setup. We'll go through the attacking armies first and foremost, as we often do, starting off over here with Panthan of Barsoom, who's going to be playing as one of the Misty Mountains armies. So we do have the Black Uruks of the Mountains here. Good unit. They're going to be the better choice of unit that the Misty Mountains have for dealing with, or at least trying to more evenly fight against forces like the elves and the dwarves in melee. Obviously they will still be found wanting in this regard, but they're a damn sight better than the rank and file that the Misty Mountains have to work with. Having said that, the Moria Spear Guard are still okay because of their armour piercing. Of course, that's not the most useful thing in the world against Mirkwood, but it will be against Dale, and certainly against Erebor later on, and they're very numerous, of course, as many Misty Mountains forces are. White Uruk Fearmongers as well, the better polearm unit that the Misty Mountains have at their disposal. Again, armour piercing phalanx, going to be useful if they can get set up, but all of the defending, well, I say all of them, the armour piercing is not that useful against Mirkwood, but the phalanx formation would be. But the dwarves and Dale do have the pikes and other polearm units as well, which can deal with the White Uruk Fearmongers, or at least make it more difficult for them to be useful. Moria Halberdiers, of course, are the lower tier option that the Misty Mountains have in this regard. Again, more numerous, nowhere near as effective, of course, but again, that formation is the main reason you'll want to use them. And again, just how numerous they are can be difficult to deal with polearms in this number if the Misty Mountains get the wind in their sails. Again, more Moria Halberdiers and Spear Guard over here. We do have the Cave Troll Drummers, very important part of the Misty Mountains roster. It keeps all of the goblins pointed in the right direction. And then just in behind we also have more Black Uruks of the Mountains, more Moria Spear Guard. There is the Goblin King's Guard in here as well, a functional and fairly numerous bodyguard unit for the class, and obviously that having more multiple HP units is always going to be a pretty useful thing. There's another unit of White Uruk Fearmongers in there as well. Moving further forward, we have Tommy, who's going to be playing as another Misty Mountains force. Again, Goblin's King's Guard, going to be the bodyguard unit. So again, functional, but that's still useful because of their numbers relative to other bodyguard units. We've got the White Uruk Fearmongers once again. Obviously they should have an easier time over here of it in terms, well, as soon as they clear the walls of Dale, they should be able to overwhelm the more limited defenders within reasonably fast. Again, similar to the last time we saw this map in its different guise. Cave Trolls, so they should be pretty useful at doing a lot of damage quickly. A nice damage spike, numerous for trolls as well, but nowhere near as resilient as the trolls from several other factions. We have more White Uruk Fearmongers, we have got more Cave Troll Drummers to keep all of these units marching in the right direction again. Moria Halberdiers and Black Uruks of the Mountains. I mean, again, they're more so against the dwarves and the elves. It will help to have this two-handed swordsman to try and equalise the quality, but against Dale they should be able to fight more evenly. So that should be pretty useful as well as they start making their way through the settlement. And then we've got 2 units of Moria Spear Guard on the front. And then attacking through the farmlands over on the other side, yet another Misty Mountains army under Tundra's Fox command. We have got some standard Goblin infantry who are just popping up from being hidden. They do have the armour upgrade to give them the same sort of faux Balrog style armour that the Misty Mountains are known for, but this isn't going to be a great difference maker in terms of their own abilities and qualities, of course. Numbers are really the main thing that they offer, but that fits in very nicely with what the Misty Mountains are going to try and do out here. 2 units of Black Uruks once again, with those two-handed swords, in fact 4 units of them, so that's not bad at all. And they also have some Mountain Orc Berserkers over here. I would be surprised if there isn't any on Tommy's army, and maybe even Panthans as well. Obviously multiple HP. Among the Berserker class units, they are probably the weakest that the Orcs have to offer. But they still do much the same job, and obviously big armour piercing damage going to be useful against Dale early on when it comes to trying to drive them out of the city, and then later on potentially as well when they have to go toe to toe with the dwarves. This is the kind of unit the Misty Mountains can really lean back on and do a good job there. We've got some Black Uruks of the mountains once again. We've got the Snow Trolls, stronger than the Cave Trolls certainly, but still not quite on the same level as the more heavy duty trolls from the other Orcish factions. But still, they can hide anywhere, they're pretty quick across the ground. Not the most useful traits in a battle like this, but they're still capable of dishing out that big damage very quickly. Moria Halberdiers, we've got the Blackback Mountain Berserkers, of course a very dangerous unit indeed. The best damage dealing infantry unit the Misty Mountains have. And still pretty numerous as well, with 83 of them. So it'll be interesting to see how they get on in this battle, considering the qualities of the defenders. More drummers, we've got the Moria Halberdiers and White Uruk Fearmongers as well. More Goblin infantry popping up, and then another unit of the Goblin King's Guard, of course, tying everything together at the back. We do have some fast movers as well in the shape of the Warg Riders. It'll be interesting to see how they get on. I think most of the defending cavalry is going to be further into the battlefield, and that'll be between the dwarves and the elves. I don't know how much cavalry the defenders will have by the time the Warg Riders arrive anyway. And finally, we've got Ricky Beagle, who's playing as the Angmar force, coming up here from the mountain path. Angmar Marauders, very similar to the Goblin Infantry that we've already seen, only a little bit stronger individually, I believe. The Goblin Infantry, very much the lowest of the low when it comes to the Orc low-end units, aside from the fodder perhaps from Mordor. Upgraded Guardians of Khand Dûm are a very dependable infantry unit indeed. They've got pretty good all-round stats, but it's defensively where they stand out, of course, especially with the armour upgrade. Big shield values, very difficult to get rid of. But having said that, of course, when it comes to the Dwarves and Elves especially, they do have the armour piercing and high damage units to be able to get the job done. So Angmar can lean on these sorts of units a little bit more so, but it's not going to be enough to simply throw them in unthinkingly. More Angmar Marauders just in behind. We've got Orc Fellas as well. Of course, any armour piercing is going to be useful against Dale and the Dwarves later on, albeit the Orc Fellas are a lower quality unit in general. Angmar Marauders, we've got Angmar Halberds as well, very, very similar to the Moria Halberdiers that we've already seen from the several Misty Mountains armies that dot the landscape. And then we've also got some Witchround Pikemen, of course. This is a point of difference between Angmar and the Misty Mountains. Not only Angmar generally being far more defensively gifted, but having these pikes is going to be a useful thing, you feel, as the battle goes on. We've got Orc Fellas and more Guardians of Khand Dûm. Of course, the Witchround Pikemen also with the armour upgrade, along with the Guardians of Khand Dûm. More Angmar Marauders. The Great Shield Infantry, the Blackwatch Legion, could be very useful later on, potentially. When the battle is still in its more open phases, they're not going to be too useful, you would think. I mean, in melee, they look very impressive, but they're maybe not as strong as you would want them to be. But when it comes to pushing through defences, that could be really, really useful for pushing the dwarves back onto the back foot. 2 units of Trolls of Angmar, so these units are stronger certainly than the Misty Mountains Trolls, and we've seen them perform very, very well. Not quite as strong still as something like the Olag Hive from Mordor, but close enough to the point where it doesn't really matter. They're going to do much the same sort of job, and there's also a few more of them. Orc Fellas at the back as well to round things off, and then finally, as we hop over the hill, we have the Dwarven Force, which is going to be under Joey's command here. So we've got some Ironfoot Warriors. I would assume that one or the other of these is going to have to be completely destroyed, and I would assume that would have to be the Dwarves, because the defenders are definitely going to need Mirkwood to be on side. But yeah, Ironfoot Warriors, this Dwarven army's goal, I guess, is to simply do as much damage to Mirkwood as they possibly can. And Ironfoot Warriors are going to do a decent job at that. I mean, they're going to be able to mitigate the damage from Mirkwood's arrows decently well. In melee, they may struggle with the Elven Finesse, but we'll see. Sons of Durin as well. I mean, these sorts of units are not going to be that useful. They've still got big base damage, of course, but armour piercing isn't really the answer when it comes to trying to deal with Mirkwood. There's a full line of them, though. That is a lot of quality. And then you've got Ironfoot pikes as well. Obviously, normally pikes will be quite worried about facing off against a force like Mirkwood, but that's not really the case with the Dwarven ones because they have got that Dwarven armour and they are shielded from the front. A very well-rounded unit. Then you've got the Ironfoot Hammer Guard in here as well, and at the back you've got Axe Throwers and Crossbows, and at the centre of everything you've got the Dragon Slayers of Eric Mithrans. This is a pretty scary Dwarven force, especially with the Dragon Slayers trackers. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how they get on here, but yeah, Mirkwood going to have to try and deal with them. So they've got the Hiriak on the front, Flame of Arnor commanding Mirkwood today, the scenario creator, so that's good. Elder Pathfinders, I mean, in terms of well-rounded cavalry, Mirkwood probably have the edge over the dwarves because they're simply more agile. Dwarven cavalry is pretty slow, so you can give them the run around pretty easily. Elven King's Guard and Hiri Peng, so I mean the Mirkwood archers are going to have to do a lot of heavy lifting early on against this Dwarven force, you would imagine, given the melee might that they have got there. And you've got the Elven King's Huntsman as well. I mean, cavalry charges could be pretty key here as long as they avoid those pikes. Hiri Lung as well with the armour upgrade, they should be pretty good against the regular Ironfoot units in melee, but again, Sons of Durin, maybe we'll be able to fight evenly with them. The pikes will worry Mirkwood as well. You've got the Hiri Peng and Elder Council. Hiriak also, and then more Hiri Peng, Elder Royal Council, Elder Council, so yeah, plenty of archers. I mean, there's going to be a lot of damage that the dwarves will have to put up with as they cross this open plain. Elder Palace Guard, of course, very, very potent unit all round. More Elder Council as well with those javelins, and finally, just up on this hillside over here, more Hiri Peng and more Elven King's Guard, so a huge variety of archers. Of course, they can hold their own in melee, but it is going to have to be at range where they do much of their work. I mean, to be fair, if they can just hold on with those spears at the front here and do some damage with the cav, then those archers should pick apart even the dwarves, to be honest. Then we have Colonel Speaks, who's playing as Dale. We've got some Lake Town pikemen over here, as well as some Dalian Swordmasters, and I think that's it. A couple of them there, but yeah, a little force from Dale, and the rest of the Dalians are in the city, so more Lake Town pikemen, more Dalian spearmen, paladins and swordmasters, so again, decent quality of units here, but they are going to be vastly outnumbered when it comes to trying to hold on to this city, and it is going to be ultimately a losing proposition if they decide to stay here long term, I think. But a second unit of paladins, that's a nice thing to have. And then you've got the Bardian Marksmen, who of course are basically just regular infantry units in melee as well. So a very well-rounded unit doing damage at range, tough in melee as well with the armour upgrade, the lamellar armour that they wear. And then they've got more Bardian Marksmen up on the walls ready to shoot the Misty Mountains as they move through the settlement. There's a couple of units still out here. Blackshots and Bardinghurst, they'll want to move back into the inner settlement as quickly as they possibly can. Certainly don't want to be losing something as potent as Blackshots early doors, given the armour-piercing arrows they have. And then the Dalian Royal Guard here at the back. And finally, last but certainly not least, here in the settlement of Erebor, we have got the defending force. So you've got, well, it technically says Elves of Mirkwood here. I suppose this is the workaround to having Erebor on both the attackers and the defenders, but yeah, we know it's Erebor, of course. Erebor Legionaries under CBE Craft's command. We've got more Erebor Legionaries, we've got the Blacklock Engineers, very deadly crossbows, of course. The Chariots, who are a bit of a hit and miss unit, and it's mostly miss, to be honest. They're very difficult to use, but if you can get them rolling, they can be pretty devastating. The Ironfoot Wargoat Chariots also have crossbow bolts of their own to deploy. We've got more Elder Royal Council, we've got Sons of Durin in here as well, Dragon Slayers Trackers, Erebor Legionaries, more Ironfoot Pikes, Sons of Durin again, so again all of this armour piercing will be brought to bear against Angmar and the Misty Mountains, so that's a little bit more like it from a defending perspective. More Sons of Durin at the back, so yeah, plenty of those Warhammers, plenty of Pikes, and good units of quality in here as well, albeit not the biggest army this, but they can really bring the heat later on with that quality of theirs. So it's not the longest battle in the world either, and I would imagine we're going to see the initial engagement between the dwarves and the elves first off, so no need for a cut, I think. We'll just get this show on the road immediately. I feel as though even more so than usual I'm going to have to keep a keen eye on the mini-map to just keep track of everything that is happening on the battlefield as it comes and goes. We can see here immediately that the Elder Pathfinders are going to start ambling their way forwards, maybe trying to keep to the theme just a little bit, but of course A fight is inevitable because, like I said, it's not as if you can change teams. This isn't something like Age of Empires 2 where you can simply betray your allies if you are given the opportunity to. Mine for Hammerguard as well. Again, this fight I think will go pretty quickly. So I don't think there will be too much of a hang-up for what will ultimately end up being a unified defensive force. I mean, this is a 5v3 after all, let's not forget, so it is really all for the defenders in this situation to try and do. I can already see some of the elves moving over towards Erebor's walls. Back go the Elder Pathfinders. And the goats, what will happen here? Are they simply going to charge directly into the front of the spears? I mean, that would obviously indicate that there are hard and fast rules about how the initial engagement can go, because normally you wouldn't willingly charge into a prepared line of elven spears like this, especially when they've got a pretty dense formation. I mean, the Dwarven Riders are reasonably solid enough. Mine for Hammerguard are very tanky, so even the pretty strong anti-cavalry presence of the Hiriak isn't going to immediately vanquish them. As we hop over to the other side of the map, we can see that the goblins are already starting to encroach into the outer part of Dale settlements. Again, very similar to when we did the War in the North scenario here, where the outer parts of the settlement is simply too large for the part of the Dalian army that is here to be able to realistically defend it, so they will have to try and defend the inner ring and then make use of the retreating lane that they do have available to them. Because being overwhelmed is something of an inevitability. A wing of Tundra's Fox's goblin army is going to be moving directly towards Erebor as well, and be meeting up with the ever-present scary force that is the Angmar. Colonel's already getting his defensive position into place. No use of the Bardian Marksman yet on either of the approaching forces, although that may change as the goblins do make their way in. And again, no real siege engines over here, so they won't be able to crumble any walls, so they are reasonably safe in the knowledge that they only have to cover 2 choke points within this part of the battlefield, but that's still not without its risks. It's relatively easy for the goblins to force their way through and get some units up on the walls just to interrupt the arrow fire, and then some units can also get cut off pretty quickly as well. And over here, so this is going to be peculiar in how it works, because effectively Joey, I think, is going to be playing the part of an army that doesn't actually do a great deal on the battlefield, because technically speaking they are enemies of their fellow dwarves at the moment, so the dwarves now emptying the settlement again. We'll keep an eye on what's happening there as things go on. We'll go chariots now moving on. I mean, it does make the defenders' job a little bit easier, because it means they don't have to deal with what is effectively a hostile dwarven army in front of their own keep. But they're still pretty scattered. The Elven battle cries start ringing out, which is usually a sign that they're opening up with their archers. Warg Riders moving forwards. Again, you don't want to get the chariots caught in a fight when their wheels are not turning. Crossbow bolts, however, are absolutely fine to use. The chances of depleting your ammunition on a unit of chariots is relatively low, as we have noted of these sorts of battles in the past. Forward come the Mountain Orc Berserkers, and they will collide with the Hiriak front line, which has already proved equal to the singular tap that they received from the dwarves, although the dwarves are actually interrupting their allies' own defensive position. Tenuous alliance at best. Meanwhile, Dale also now. Again, I feel as though Dale are probably going to need to begin their retreat relatively soon, otherwise not a whole lot is going to be saved from this. Bardian Marksman as well. There is the line of thinking that you could leave the entire Dalian army here. Obviously fighting within the city happened throughout the battle of the 5 armies after all, so if you leave them here, maybe even with some reinforcements from further afield, you could potentially get some really good damage done on these 2 goblin armies. Dale have certainly got the archer presence to be able to make this a very grisly fight initially for the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. It's just whether or not their own numbers will manage to maintain themselves well enough. Again, this is pretty much the exact position in the War in the North scenario as well, where a fight broke out between the advancing Easterlings, and at that point it was the dwarves holding on to this choke point primarily, whereas here it is going to be the elves. And here Ironfoot will go chariots. Still firing away with those crossbows, but Elder Royal Council probably going to be the more devastating of the 2 units because of the volume of missiles that are going to be finding their way into goblin bodies. Just advancing around the corner as well, Angmar. It's hard to know really how they deal with this because of the setup that they've needed to employ. Although they are able to, of course. They've used the same technique as the 8-way free-for-alls. Shows you how long it's been since I got given this replay, because I'm sure Flame of Arnor told me about that. Yeah, so this means that this army can effectively completely focus on the Orcish forces, and indeed they will need to, because technically they're a separate team to the people who they're fighting alongside now. Very carefully Mirkwood have set up some archers in support of this force, but yes, so this makes a lot more sense now in terms of how it's set up. But this force over here is surrounded, the dwarves guarding the backs of the initial attack. Panthan of Barsoom's job is probably the hardest actually of the attackers now, because he's caught between the heart of all of the defences over here, and there's a lot of quality flitting around between the dwarves and the elves of all stripes, so trying to make something happen here on his own is probably going to be quite difficult. In many ways he might be best trying to slow his pace up a little bit, because it's going to be over here where surely the defenders are going to start to feel the strain, because there is a portion of a Misty Mountains army and a full Angmar army over here, which can be difficult to stop even for forces like Mirkwood and Erebor. The trolls are on the front line now as well. That's always going to be a bit of a concern, but the elves do have their heavy swordsmen here, one of the better units that they can use to counteract the trolls. Probably only the Sons of Durin would be better. Indeed, another unit of them is moving in now. So well prepared so far. The combination of dwarves and elves is always going to be a tough nut to crack when you're in a relatively narrow battlefield position. Angmar do have the staying power to potentially make it happen. Damage coming in from the berserkers as well. Moving across to the other side, we've got the snow trolls. And this is what I was fearing for the Dalians who are fighting within the city, is the fact that when you can force your way forwards like this, especially when it's a unit of trolls, I mean, these archers will certainly have ammunition which is now going to go unused. And if Dale do intend to stick around here in this settlement, they're going to have to try and do as much damage as possible, because this is probably, from an Orcish perspective, with the lay of the land now, the most fruitful hunting ground for them. They could very well seize the city of Dale in its entirety, move through it, and then open up another attacking lane for the dwarves and the elves, or primarily the dwarves and the elves. Back over here there is another wave of Panthan's goblins moving forward, but not much of an impression has been made on the dwarven defensive line so far, but you wouldn't expect there to be really, given the odds that the goblins are facing over here. Any damage at all that they are capable of doing. Be appreciated, I'm sure. Ironfoot crossbows as well. This is going to be a lot. This is going to be brutal damage, but at the very least, over on this side of the front line is where the more important units have been clustered: the trolls, the White Eric Fearmongers, the berserkers. So they will do more damage over here, and that's the key for this goblin army. So we're using the troll drummers. under Moria Halberds. Moving into the other part of Panthan's army is also trying to stretch the dwarven and elven resources over on this side of the battlefield, but again, just Moria Halberds. It's more the fact that these weapons will not be pointed at the Angmar Misty Mountains push over on the other side, which is the real victory here, but Blackrock Engineers are in a pretty good position, as are the Elder Council. Eerie Lung out of ammunition now by the looks of things, which is always a good sign, really, because it means that all your ammunition has been utilised, and quantity of kills for the Free Peoples of Middle-earth here is going to be the most important thing, because if they can make the attackers run out of steam as they move along here, that's going to be a real difference maker. Still some units in reserve. Warg Riders and Guardians of Khan Dune. The Blackwatch Legion get used at some point? I mean, if they did, then they would have been relatively ineffective, because the front line has remained pretty much stock still in place. It's a relatively thinning front line, though, from a defending perspective. It wouldn't take too much more to loosen the latch, but time is running short. I think the defenders are in a reasonably good spot. The attackers need to try and start putting pressure on the defenders from more angles if they can, but the only way they're going to be able to do that, I think, is if the goblins manage to clear Dale in its entirety. More Ironfoot Pikes and the Moria Halberdiers flee as a result. Hammerguard now hanging around here as well. Let's not forget that Joey's army is technically hostile to everyone else on the field. From a mechanical perspective, although he is a player, he's certainly doing his job for the cause. And then Black Shots Dragon Slayers. Interestingly, the Trolls not going after them directly and instead electing to attack into the rear of this defensive position. There are some Hiri Lang, so the Elves have come to try and offer a little bit of support to the Dalians as well, but it's not going to end too well for the defenders in here. As I mentioned, you've got Dalian Royal Guard up on the high ground over there, you've got Bardian Marksmen, so still you're going to be able to shower the Goblins and the Trolls and the Orcs with arrows as they move forward, but it's not really going to work to win the battle in its entirety. In a similar way to Panthan at the gates of Erebor, they are going to have to simply try and do as much damage to this attacking force as they can, and that can make all the difference later on. And to be fair to Panthan's army, it's still pointing in the right direction in parts, and this side of the front line has actually done very, very well for itself. Elsewhere, though, the Dwarven front line is looking very, very good. Moria Halberds turning around and managing to intercept the Ironfoot Hammerguard, and they're starting to drop now. Big anti-cavalry and armor-piercing damage together. It's exactly the sort of thing which can deal with Dwarven Riders very, very nicely. Black Orcs are fleeing in the distance. Ironfoot Axe Throws as well. The strongest of Joey's units back there, the Hiri Peng and Ironfoot Crossbows together. Able to get some good raking shots over what's left of this part of the front line over here. Can't ask for too much more than that, I don't think, based on how the cards were drawn. But now, remnants of the force that he sent to distract some of the defenders over here have been dealt with, so all of the dwarves and elves that were over here can now turn around and block Angmar's continued advance. There are the Blackwatch Legion moving forwards now. Interestingly, the chariots being in the way will actually mitigate this somewhat, because they're one of the few units which have got the kind of mass which even Great Shield units are simply not going to be able to match, albeit the chariots will die off as a result of this manoeuvre relatively fast, you would imagine. Hiri Peng moving forwards also. Once again, so that would be something as well. I think the Elven units will actually have Dwarven officers as part of them, because they're technically labelled as an Erebor army. Engineers, though, continuing to lay down some very impressive damage indeed. Clonk of those bolts.
Without their general, they may lose heart and flee.
Wargs hovering around in the backfield, but they're not really going to have much of a chance to charge through a gap and start making a nuisance of themselves with the way things are. Victory seems certain for some of the Orc fellas, and the Guardians of Khan Doom over here. The Trolls are in there, which is making a big difference. I mean, Elven Archers in melee are obviously very adept at what they do, but you're talking about going up against Trolls and really heavily armoured Orc infantry together. Quite as strong as the dedicated swordsman variant. Meanwhile, over here, you can see that the city ultimately is lost. Only a few of the Dalians still remain. There's some Hiri Pang there as well, marching somewhere, but you can see on the minimap some units are starting to exit the settlement. Or actually no, some units are moving forward to reinforce what remains, but they're going to arrive a little bit late to save Colonel Speaks' hide here. Will offer another speed bump for what remains of the attacking forces over here, but again, it's hardly a limitless army at this point. So the attackers have to try and make their way through. Yet more resistance. And then of course there's the small matter of Joey's army at the back as well. Elven King's Huntsman having to weave in and out of the technically hostile dwarves. But charging in there. I mean, White Uruk Fearmongers are going to be very deadly to any cavalry that they manage to land hits against, but not much left now remains of this small attacking force, but all of it is elite. The White Uruks are, well, there are some Moria Halberds in there as well, but White Uruks, Blackback Mountain Berserkers, Goblin Kingsguard, the finest offerings that the Misty Mountains have in terms of infantry. Trying to do a little bit more damage. Again, this being the final backup really is going to be something which is ultimately insurmountable for the attackers, I think, but then this is more of a narrative-focused battle anyway. Guardians of Khan Doom. Defeat seems certain for them. Continuing to move forward, finally able to interrupt the Blacklock Engineers, who have had a fairly long period of time in this battle where they've been able to continuously unload their bolts at the enemy. Elder Pathfinders managing to sort of not clatter into only their own units, sort of intersecting one another reasonably well there. Ricky taking more losses as a result. Elder Council defeat does seem certain for the remnants of these infantry units on the front line now. The Palace Guard are still here, but they're having to deal with trolls, and again, it might be a very narrow initial victory here for the attackers, but they're going to need to meet up with what remains of the attacking force in the city to try and combine their efforts to see if they can march on Erebor itself. Orc Fellas defeat seems certain. I'm going to go directly into the Dwarven pike line. The Drummer's still there though. Going to be the last ones left standing actually for the attackers that were coming from this angle. Meanwhile, surely victory is going to be theirs here. Yeah, Hiri Pang going down. The Elder Royal Council will probably suffer the same fate unless they get out of here, but they should be able to outpace what, well, maybe they wouldn't outpace the Snow Trolls actually. The Snow Trolls are pretty quick across the ground. Some Dwarven units moving forward to try and block the way. I mean, if you're going to lose one of these, you would want it to be the Legionaries and not the Royal Council, but in an ideal world you would lose neither. Looks like they're going to try and lay on another defence here though, because there are Ironfoot pikes on the way forward, going to set themselves up in defensive position. They could end up having to fight uphill though, which is a little bit unfortunate, and they will also have the small matter of having to deal with trolls. Tried and tested countermeasure, 2 pikes. attacks will need a bit of support pretty fast. Here. Again, the Elder Pathfinder's finding gaps, but when the battle opens up in what, for a battle of this size, is the later stages.
The enemy general lies dead.
That's easy to do. There goes Panthan's general, who, in all fairness, again, I know that I've mentioned it several times, but probably lasted a little bit longer as an attacking force than maybe is to be expected, given the fact that splitting the attention was necessary. This Dwarven army has had some blows landed on it as well. Obviously they can't directly assist their allies because of the fact that they are technically an enemy force. They would start fighting, but they can always be the backstop, essentially. Deal with any Orcish forces that do manage to get through the defensive setup, which is not likely over here any longer, I would suggest. There's the Angmar general. Obviously they will be filling the role of Gundabad. Guardians of Gundabad. Elder Pathfinder's charging in. Unfortunate perhaps to not skewer the general there with that charge. He was completely exposed after all. Then the attacker's last and only hope is that the goblins over here manage to do the business. And in all fairness, this unit of heavy goblin crossbows is in the perfect position to get those raking shots. There, the Angmar general gets skewered. Yeah, those side-swiping hits there from the crossbows, absolutely lethal. The goblins will now be able to resume their march through the town. And as a result of this, they should be able to clear Dale and at least put on an effort of trying to force their way into Erebor in the distance. I suppose continuing to do their thing. I mean, saving as much ammunition as possible is probably a necessity, given the Goblin Kingsguard are going to take a look around the Daily and Royal Palace, I suppose, but when they're done with things, they will have to continue to move. The Elder Royal Council did get out of there, in all fairness. So even here, even when they are forced onto the back foot somewhat, the defenders are able to salvage something which will be of use to them later. Setting up a defensive position over here. Now the interesting game begins, really, where the Joey's Erebor army tries to avoid his allies, in quotation marks, while still being helpful to them. If they're able to get that right, then even though this is a decent little Misty Mountains force, I don't see how they could overturn the deficit that they're now working with. The announcer may say that defeat seems certain, but that's because the announcer is seeing what is effectively a three-way fight, which Medieval 2, I should say, was not designed for in the first place. Here's decent number of Black Uruks, White Uruk Fearmongers, always a helpful unit to have. Blackbacks, a little bit damaged and dinged up after their encounter with the Elder Royal Guard, or Elder Royal Council. Earlier on, the drummers falling very quickly to the Erebor legionaries backed up by those dwarven pikes, so again another speed bump for the attackers to get through, and their general falls as well. Yeah, this is the problem that you see. So they're going to have to try and peel themselves off one another. Obviously normally you would want the pikes to be reinforcing this front line, but as it is, they're actually infighting. Bizarre indeed, but when you're trying to make this battle, there are some limitations within the game that you have to try and overcome. Now the dwarves are starting to struggle as the numbers from the Misty Mountains attack starts to climb. Obviously Whiter Fearmongers are going to be pretty damn good against regular dwarven infantry. They would be worried about Ironfoot pikes if they were in greater numbers, but that's not so much a problem for here. More and more Black Uruk starting to pour forwards also. Now the mass push comes, just trying to swamp over what remains of the dwarven resistance so they can then cross the bridge where the real fight begins, really. Elder Royal Council thinking about joining back in, but thinking better of it in the end. Electing to retreat back across the bridge, albeit there is something else on the way, another unit of Ironfoot pikes. Again, another speed bump, but not really anything of too much note. Nothing that would really give them pause. Dragon Slayer's trackers are in position now as well. They'll be pretty devastating with the damage they can do as the goblins cross the bridge. A lot of these goblins, of course, are halberdiers, unshielded, so the throwing axes' brutal effectiveness is only going to be even stronger. Whether or not the front line here of pikes is able to hold on for the allotted period of time for them to be able to lay down that effectiveness. Remains of the drummers are simply going to be thrown in again as well. I mean, it makes sense at this point. The mass is really what you need, but from an Orcish perspective, this battle was always going to be a very tough one. And indeed, they are going to be sent packing here, I think. You never know. Could we see infighting yet? So Joey's army is going to take the entirety of one side and then the other forces on the other side. There's a few Blacklock engineers in there, in and amongst the Dragon Slayer's trackers. Black Uruks of the mountains. Numbers ever dwindling. Standard Goblin Infantry are still a unit that are alive, which is impressive given their lowly nature. Kingsguards 71 still remain. One Cave Troll Drummer is electing to stare vacantly off into the water. Contemplating the life choices which brought him to this point, I would imagine. Being thrown in against some of the finest warriors in Middle-earth. That's a general model. No, that's a standard Kingsguard. The Goblin, or the Misty Mountains general model, is a little bit taller than the units that are all around him, so he does tend to stand out a little bit. Maybe not so much when you've got a mosh pit of a fight like this. Trolls continuing to barge their way forwards. Like systematically, the force of the Misty Mountains, which was initially attacking Dale, have overcome each defensive position that had been put in front of them, but each one has just worn them down a little bit more and a little bit more, and ultimately they're not going to be left with enough gas in the tank. Dragon Slayer's trackers will only add to that, and a brutal pincer defense has also been set up here as well. And it's not a limitless amount of forces that they have here. Free peoples, so it's obviously far too much for the Misty Mountains to be able to be victorious here, but the margin isn't maybe as stark as it may appear to be. Occasional crossbow bolt now being utilised. Trying to thread the needle through the arches there. Any bolt, any additional kill will just increase the goblins' pride before their fall. Pikes rotating around. Huntsman, I mean, cavalry is not going to be the most important unit type to have in this sort of engagement, you would suggest. Slayers, trackers, the latest in the line of defensive positions which have been overcome. So the Moria Spearguard immediately rout upon seeing the defence which awaits for them. And the standard medieval 2 logic of a routing unit deciding to go right through the thickest part of the opposition defence to try and make their retreat. They've got one of the safest retreats they could have as well through the settlement they've already taken. In go the Ironfoot warriors, Joey wanting to further bloody his weapons before the battle is over. Again, a weird role that he's played, of course. Something a little bit more conventional this time, perhaps. The Royal Council, who were involved in the defence for the interior of the settlement, of course, are now going to be around to see the battle to its conclusion. The infantry still there. The saviours of the day? I think not. Elder Royal Council once again getting themselves off the front line. Classic Thranduil behaviour, this. Immediately, of course, the heavy goblin crossbows being seen as the one true threat. Immediately going to get lit up by Blacklock engineers and Ironfoot crossbows. The difference in quality between the finest dwarven crossbows and some goblins in ramshackle armour going to be made starkly apparent now, you would suggest. Goblin Kingsguard very tired. It's been an arduous road for them, of course, only to be met with no hope right at the end of the battle. Sons of Durin in reserve as well. Heavy goblin crossbows are routing. Is the battle going to end with Joey betraying his allies, perhaps? The one non-narrative thing, I guess, that we would see here, because it was clear that this battle was fought with that very much in mind. Akaruks are now fleeing also. Elves are going to quit the field as well by the looks of it. Surely there can't be this long left in the battle. I mean, this is all that remains of the goblins, and they're being scattered relatively easily at this point. During charge in. Joey is setting up his forces as if they are going to fight, and it does look as though they are going to. Now we depart from reality. Which means, I mean, we do still have a fight to conduct, I suppose, but here I think Joey is going to be the one with the overwhelming advantage here as well, because of the nature of the fight, he had to hang back and basically be the backstop, so more of his army is fresh. So let's see if the Battle of the Five Armies had a tragic end. Last one standing. Nothing up here. Pathfinders and Elven King's Huntsmen may find more of their niche in a fight like this. I mean, technically the goblins are still active on the field as well. Elder Council utilising their javelins. Elven King's Guard up against the Dragon Slayer's trackers. The trackers do have the edge in terms of their second hit point, but the two-handed axe against the more defensive unit also offers them a bit of an edge. Elder Royal Council, plenty of ammunition left still as well. All of this ranged punishment that the elves can still dish out. That's going to be the true fight for the end. Thranduil's Royal Council, or at least one of the two units that are on the field, going to be dealt with by the Dwarven backfield. Some healthy Dragon Slayers of Erebor and Mirkwood as well. Cavalry charges and perfect use of something like the Elder Royal Council will be required to get rid of units like that, but there are other targets that require attention as well. Blacklock Engineers are not the finest melee combatant, but they are still a big brick of armour and a second hit point. Tough to wear down for sure. Actually, no, did they may have. I think they had their second hit point removed actually, but it's been a while since I've done the faction overviews. More Dwarven units filtering their way across after the backfield victory against the remnants of the goblins and the elves. We didn't actually see who struck the first renewed blow between the two, so it's up to you to decide who may have been the traitors here. It's a nice charge though from the huntsman. Big damage on the Blacklock Engineers there, they're going to need plenty more of that. And the goblins are still technically up and about as well. 21 of them, I mean, not that many. Take a Herculean effort for them to prove victorious in the long run here. Ironfoots reforming themselves. Kingsguard getting in and amongst the elven units, so if they're intent on playing Kingmaker, they'd rather Erebor be victorious in the long run in this fight as opposed to Mirkwood. Hiriax started this fight facing dwarves, and they're going to end it, albeit it doesn't seem like they're going to be on the victorious side. Crossbows trying to bring down those elven riders, I mean, understandably so as well, because that charge they got into the Blacklocks was a really tough show of strength. Probably their only hope for trying to reverse the numbers deficit that they were up against here. Now the Royal Council now getting into melee. The pikes are awaiting them. Ever one of Mirkwood's nemesis. When they don't have ammunition. We are now in the dying embers of this battle, and it does look as though the dwarves are going to be victorious. The Dalians perishing within their city. The elves unable to get what they wanted out of this encounter, albeit the orcs also go home vanquished. The dwarves would be very happy with this outcome. Debatably about the demise of Dale, but I suppose in this scenario where the battle has restarted, peace was never an option. There goes Legolas, technically speaking, with the model that he's using. So we've now very much gone off the point where this is certainly not a canon event. Those Dragon Slayers finally finishing off the goblins. The general, the last one standing. Some elves still in the backfield. The cleanup continues. Axe throwers and crossbows. The narrow victory. But then again, Joey, I mean, it's not as if he had to approach the battle in a certain way, and it ended up working out quite nicely in his favour in the end. Like I said, having that extra strength in the backfield. I mean, Panthan's army did do its share of damage against that Erebor force, but nowhere near to the extent that Mirkwood and Dale were taking blows. Choice them certain the Dragon Slayers against the ever-dwindling number of Elder Royal Councilmen. There we go. Throwing axe volley to try and speed the Hiriak along a little bit. Victorious, very little remains of the Elven King's Guard over here, individually far stronger in melee than the Ironfoot axe throwers, but hideously outnumbered now. And we can't even really look at the percentages here because it's a three-way fight, and indeed the tooltip doesn't even show up. And all the remains of the Dwarven force is before us. A few axe throwers on the periphery, a decent brick of pikes, and then their elites over here finishing off what remains. There's Gimli. In and among the Dragon Slayers of Erebor Mithril. Just the one left? Yes, indeed. The final stand, and there he goes. Is that it? There's one Hiripang, one Son of Durin, albeit it's the banner carrier. There's only 200 frames left, so is this guy going to get the job done quickly? He is. Stabbed, run through with the blunt end of an axe. And there we go. So yeah, a weird fight, to be sure. But I think when it comes to trying to recreate the Battle of the Five Armies with the initial fight between the elves and the dwarves included in it, I think this is about as good as you're going to be able to make it in the Medieval 2 mechanics, because without team switching, this is the way that you would have to handle it. And obviously at the end, you know, they turned on one another to give a sort of natural conclusion to the fight once again. But yeah, I think an interesting one, and as well as you could make the Battle of the Five Armies. So big thank you to the Flame of Arnor for creating this scenario and for running with it. I mean, this is one of my favourite maps just in general. I was lucky enough to play on it once before, of course, and just combining two effectively really big set piece maps is hard to do, but it makes sense on this occasion, and it's always worked out really nicely, I think. And on this occasion it was just the same map, but viewed through a slightly different lens, arguably through a more iconic battle, albeit I think because of the way Medieval 2 works. I think the War in the North scenario before was certainly the more well-rounded of the two. This one more narratively focused, certainly interesting from the way that it was set up, but obviously the balancing, I think this is one of those where the outcome, you could almost say it was as set in stone as a battle's outcome can be from the off, because of the fact that Joey was always going to have a lot left in the tank right at the end, so there was no way the Orcs were going to be able to make their way through all of those forces. I mean, the Misty Mountains did well against Dale to slowly go through each of those defensive positions, but obviously that took its toll. Panthan had to split his army against two forces which he was not that well equipped to deal with. He could have done a reasonable job against one if he could focus his army, but that ended up not being the case. And then Angmar, with a little bit of Misty Mountain support, were attacking from the other side, but that was effectively where the defence was at its strongest, with elves and dwarves fighting side by side, and that was always going to be a tough ask as well. But then for Mirkwood, and it wasn't really Dale in the end because all of their forces perished, but for Mirkwood to then see themselves over the line in this fight that was always going to be unlikely as well, because they were in the thick of things right from the off, and Joey by design had to sort of save more of his army, because otherwise it would have, mechanically this fight would have fallen apart if Joey was allowed to sort of intermingle with his allies, in quotation marks, earlier in the fight, because they would have started infighting and then everything would have gone a bit chaotic. I mean, that might have been fun to see, but it also would not have been the narrative of the fight at all, which obviously it did go off script towards the end, but that was kind of a necessity. So yeah, as I said, some eccentricities to this fight, but it's about as well as a Battle of the Five Armies scenario with all of the bells and whistles of shifting loyalties can be done in Medieval 2. So let's see what did the damage for the Mirkwood and Erebor army. Captain Thranduil over here, so Elder Royal Council and Elder Council doing quite nicely. Hiriek, I mean, they showcased their defensive chops in this battle, I think. They did pretty nicely initially against those charges, and then also at defending the front lines, as you would expect. Standard infantry units for the elves all doing quite nicely. Hiri Lung and Hiri Peng, I mean, you can see here the Hiri Peng, more kills because they were able to use their bows and then pulling out their two-handed blades later on. Pathfinders and Huntsmen also did very, very nicely, even into the late game when the recommencing of hostilities between the elves and the dwarves had taken place. We saw good examples of the Mirkwood cavalry doing its thing. The main weakness to the Mirkwood cavalry is the fact that they are relatively fragile. You know, their armor scores are low. The Elven King's Huntsmen don't have shields, so you know they're pretty easy to snipe off from a distance as well. Pathfinders, of course, do have that second hit point, but that'll only take you so far. But one thing they do have, very good melee defense, so they can actually mitigate damage when they're cycling in and out reasonably well. And also good charges, like any spear/lance cavalry is going to have, and that was utilised very nicely on this occasion. Palace Guard doing decently well, 281, and then Elven King's Guard as well. Maybe less well than I would expect. The axes should have been pretty good against all of the Orc units and the Erebor ones, but again, it is what it is. And then the mixed army, we've got Elder Royal Council doing slightly better. Obviously Ironfoot Pikes, which were very, very effective for this force and of course for Joey's force as well, made it pretty much insurmountable for any hostiles at that stage in proceedings. Very, very good basic pike though, as we mentioned, pretty much the best at what they do without going into those upper tier units with far higher price tags. The shield really does help them in that regard. Erebor Legionaries, Sons of Durin as well, getting good kills. The Chariots doing not too bad for themselves, but I feel like a decent proportion of those kills are going to be from the crossbow bolts more than anything. They were acting more as sort of like mobile battlefield turrets on this occasion, as opposed to being the bludgeons that Chariots can sometimes be used as. Dragonslayer's Trackers as well, doing a pretty good job on that bridge towards the end to help pad their kill count out a bit. And the Blacklock Engineers, we did mention those in the fight as well, getting into a really good position to rain hell down upon Angmar. And they haven't had a really good performance in quite a while, actually, I think, so it's actually quite heartening to see them do well, but it was a pretty ideal situation for them in the end. Erebor Legionaries as well, and yeah, decent kills across the board. So once again, big thank you to the Flame of Arnor for setting this one up, and a big thank you to all the players as well for being a part of it. As far as what's going to be coming up next, I have had some queries about older replays that I'm going to do, but I will repeat here, as I've often repeated, if I get given a new map or a new scenario, it takes precedence over a map that we've seen in the past. And that will remain the case. Basically, I'm trying to get through all the new maps, but obviously when someone gives me a new one, you know, it just bumps it down the queue again. I do know exactly the ones that I've missed on this occasion, so I will get to all of them eventually, but because of circumstances beyond my control, I haven't been able to go back to doing 2 replays a week. That would have been the way that I would have caught up. But as it is, I wasn't able to do that because of a whole load of different things happening. Obviously, best laid plans and all that. It didn't end up panning out for me. I do still intend to do that, hopefully at some point in the new year. But for the time being, we're running at the same pace, and that means, you know, new maps, new content, stuff that we haven't seen before, takes precedence over those old maps that we have seen before. That's just the way it is. But I will get to them. Don't worry. Speaking of, there are a few more. There is another map from the Womb Raider Medexa / other people collaboration effort, which I think will be the next one. A sort of winter themed fallen Arnorian settlement. which we'll be looking at. That's a more cityscape style standard siege. There's also the beginning of a narrative set of scenarios from Flame of Arnor. He's got the first 2 done, and I think we're still waiting on the 3rd one, so depending on progress on that, it might be back to back to back that we do that. And then there's a few other new maps as well which I've been given. So yeah, effectively from now through to the new year we've got all new content. Obviously at the end of the year I will do this sort of standard channel update video, which I think is quite important because quite a lot has happened this year. You know, it's been maintaining the channel has been difficult over the course of 2025 for a number of reasons which I'll go into there, albeit I think the worst of that has certainly passed at this point, so I think maintaining the channel now is going to be less of an issue than it was, so there's no real problem there. But again, this is the sort of thing which I will go into in the sort of Christmas New Year channel update thing, which has become a bit of a regularity thing. So yeah, I'll save all of my rambling for that, I think, because we've already chewed up quite a lot of time here in the endgame splash screen. So yeah, once again, big thank you to the Flame of Arnor and all of the players for making this battle possible and for allowing me to show it. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.